You're listening to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. Hello, and welcome to City of Muses, a brand new podcast on the Paris Underground Radio Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and each week I'll be sitting down with an artist or creative to talk about what inspires them, what their creative process is like, and how Paris fits into it all. My guest this week is Carrie Chappell. Above all else, Carrie is a lover of language. She's a poet, essayist, teacher, editor, and translator from Birmingham, Alabama. She's published 2 books of poetry, one of which, Loving Tallulah Bankhead, she'll read from today. Carrie's poems have appeared in publications like Iron Horse Literary Review, Juke Joint, Nashville Review, and Redivider, and her lyric and book essays have been published in Fanzine, New Delta Review, the Iowa Review, the Rumpus, and the Rupture, among others. She teaches at Université Paris 1, Sorbonne, curates the digital anthology Verse of April, and is co-translating Sandra Moussempès' award-winning collection Cassandre, bout, portant. Hello, Carrie. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm really happy to be here with you and to share a little bit of my world and certainly connect with all that you're bringing together with Paris artists.
Thank you for being a part of it. I have really enjoyed the things of yours that I've read. But before we get into that, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I am a writer, a poet, I guess sort of first of all, but I write essays as well, some of those being more personal, some of them being more like kind of, I call them book essays, but they're probably book reviews. But I don't really like the critical or sort of not even summarial kind of aspect of book reviewing. I like to sort of think of them as actually another kind of essay form where I'm just bringing in the work of somebody that I really myself responded to and had a need maybe even to write into that. I'm also a teacher. I teach English currently, and I edit and translate. I have an editorial project that is called Verse of April that is dedicated to rendering or paying, though that always sounds incorrect to me, tributing, but paying homage to the poets. And it's been a special dedication in the last few years to do that to living poets. When I first started the collection in 2015, people were going through all decades and generations, and it's supposed to be international, though I think the attraction has been mostly from my countries where I've lived, so the United States and France, but I have hosted people from other cultures and other languages, and that's always been quite a pleasure, actually. And then as a translator, I am currently co-translating with Amanda Murphy, a professor at Paris 3, a collection by Sandra Moussempès that it just came out and won an award this year from the French Academy. I guess it was for her collection, but in a way I think she felt and maybe even the Academy acknowledges that this is for her oeuvre. It's been maybe some time coming that her work get this kind of recognition, and we'll be looking for a publisher for that very soon because our first draft is basically finished. So,
wow, that's incredible. So you're working with her for this translation?
Well, she's been in conversation with us, and it was, I guess, Amanda and Sandra made the first connection. And Sandra has been translated into English before, has been published in both small presses, independent presses in the United States and in Canada. And I think even in some journals in both, well, in North America in general, I guess. And she was actively looking for a translator for this collection. I think maybe she too had a feeling that it was a kind of a rival. It's a rather large collection when we think of the book, the actual page number for poetry. And compared to her other works, it's quite a project. Then when she, I think through just a academic or literary connection, found Amanda Murphy, and then Amanda and I, who have been, I guess, exchanging in multiple ways for several years. I think Amanda, who is a writer in her own right, even though I don't know if she quite admits herself to be that yet, or she's certainly probably producing more academic writing, but she felt she wanted someone who was really connected to a poetry world and might bring, I guess, if it's not I don't know, I'm not trying to brag, but just that I would bring a sensibility to it, a poet's sensibility to translating poetry, because she's certainly, Amanda can do enormous things in French and has, I think, probably more flexibility than I do, but I I do, I guess, have a connection to the language that might be not as formalized through the academic lens of expression, etc. And Sandra is, I would say, in her work, resisting some of the formalities of language, trying to make a space for women's voices that goes beyond what we've allowed them to do in the past.
I imagine that translating poetry must bring an enormous amount of challenge with it.
Oh, yes. I'm reading a book right now called This Little Art by Kate Briggs, who is a very established translator. And it's really been intriguing to me to see some of the text that she's brought together in the book, but then, of course, what she's also filtering through her own experience. And I just identified a lot with, I haven't finished it, and it's also a big book, but just the thought that she has, and now I'm not going to be able to quote from it, but she talks about it as just when people translate, they are okay with puzzles. And I don't think I ever thought of myself as somebody really attracted to word cross or Sudoku or all the kind of typical puzzle things that we might see that maybe a kind of mass culture consumes, but that translating is a really interesting exercise for the mind that likes to live in question. And she also shares that you will publish and I think this is the same with poetry and probably anybody who writes or hosts podcasts, you put something in one little package of words. And then, of course, even if that is released and published and online or on social media, that sort of want to redact and make comments or rephrase, it just doesn't stop. And that is a kind of juice, you might feel like it could be failure if you didn't say it the right way, but there's always maybe, if you're lucky enough, another opportunity to reformulate in another context, perhaps.
Well, and poetry is interesting too, because it's so much about what isn't said as much as it is about what is said. So you've also got to play with the spaces between and the sounds and the rhythm and the meaning.
Yes, surely.
I mean, it seems like almost an insurmountable task. Where do you find that you like to start?
In my own writing, it has varied, and I don't know if I can always sort of plan for it. I think I am interested in sound almost more than I think I used to want to admit. It's been important for me that there is a kind of musicality, something that I just enjoy, like if I were to read it out loud. And I have built that into my process. I didn't do it at the very beginning because I think I started writing poetry almost in secret. It was, my own little secret. But once I got kind of more committed to it being a life path, which is now what it certainly is, I liked that I could just say that the poems felt good to me in my mouth, or even in whatever I thought the music was sort of playing in my head with those words as I was writing it or even editing it. And I think there are probably some drawbacks to that too. I mean, I sometimes think about how almost silly and débile it is that I like alliteration. I think, and then my stupid name is Carrie Chappell. It's like, I can't, maybe there's a reason you like that. But I still think that there's something that can happen there. I do know that some other writers are really turned off by it because it can feel forced. It can feel precious and cute. I don't know. I'm also interested in it being present in some spaces, but not being, I'm not writing a poem with the letter B starting every line or something like that. It still has to be an alliteration that makes logical. It's not meaningless for me.
It's not a gimmick.
I mean, maybe it is. on one tiny side of it, if I'm really honest with myself, I think there is a bit of gimmick to it, but I don't think that. One of the more interesting revelations that I've had recently is that gimmick and aesthetic and some things that we call superficial are actually a space where something kind of intriguing and interesting on, psychologically and about artistry. There's a lot of meaning there too. And I don't, not in some like vapid, I want to say Californian way, because I grew up on the East Coast and California was like the place in the United States where my parents and other people were like, look at that culture. That's not what we want for you. But, I've been to Los Angeles. I've been to a few other places in California. It's not just sunglasses and seafoam, but But it's, and there I made alliteration, damn. I think it's a coping mechanism.
There's something, when I was reading your poetry before this conversation, there's something about it that like almost forced me to read it out loud. The way that it's written, it looks lyrical, and it didn't feel right just to read it on the page. So I did read it out loud to myself.
Oh, that's cool.
And I think that's what made me really love it. It feels immersive in a way.
Well, that's interesting to hear. I don't know where that comes from exactly. I think I also remember being in a writing group when I lived in New Orleans, which was where I lived just before moving to Paris. And I remember, and this person meant it with so much like goodness. It was just the kind of criticism that you want to be thankful for. But I remember it sent me on a kind of trip of, revisiting all that I do and thinking myself maybe, some sort of poser or I don't know what. But they were commenting on this particular person, I guess a way that I mixed English register or like American English register, and some of it being, I guess, more talky, more of the street, more of, what you might pick up in a restaurant or maybe at that point on the streets of New Orleans somewhere, just really intrigued with what people say to each other. But then I would sometimes kind of intermesh that with things that probably came from a register that is more parental and certainly more, when I thought about it, I was like, oh, that's my mom. That's my mom's voice that comes into my writing. And my mother was an English teacher. She used to recite the prelude to the Canterbury Tales in Middle English as she was making us dinner because she had her students reciting that for her as memory work as one of their major grades. And I just think that those things are, they're canticles. I don't write in Middle English, but I think that her self-presentation had a huge influence on the ways that I was, remixing some of her to make me and then other environmental factors. But at the level of language, I think what happens to us when we're young is quite impactful. And I don't know, I grew up on musicals, I guess. So sometimes I think I'm just still trying to write a song.
Do you remember when you were first attracted to poetry? Like when it first became something for you in your own world?
Yes, a little. Well, I remember this particular moment because it ended up being a little bit of a moment of shame later on. But I remember that I had been given, I think they were like little hardbound books that maybe my parents were finding at Books A Million or Barnes & Noble. They would do every once in a while in those kind of big box stores. Like the first aisles of the stores would be sale books, and they would put a big old nasty, like yellow sticker. But in some of those rows, they would have strange little anthologies for sale, and there were often anthologies of poetry. And I remember distinctly that I can't remember now if it was my mother or sometimes my mother was given money by my grandparents to buy us a present for Christmas. And even though it might have said like from granddad or something, I opened it and I was like, this was obviously my mother buying this for me. But one that was a collection of American poems, one that was a collection of Shakespearean sonnets. And that was just sort of like a little mini series of my preteens that I was getting this kind of book at Christmas. And I think it was at once the present that you were like, this is a poetry collection.
Who is this really for?
Yeah. But, they went into my room. They were there in my room when I was bored and had an impact in that there was something, they did have, even though it was a sale book, an elegance in presentation. So there was that, and it came from what felt like it came from my mother. And that was a big presence, but I don't think it felt like poetry that I was supposed to. It was way before anybody told me you could actually take elements of a Shakespearean sonnet and kind of like, borrow the meter or even like take 2 words out of it and start your own poem. That was something that the creative writing world kind of taught me later was possible, accepted, and fun to try forever, as long as you're not completely, plagiarizing or something.
Are you a book lover who's always looking for the next best book? Or an avid reader who'd love the chance to ask their favorite author a question? Well, then you might like my other podcast, Storytime in Paris, where I interview writers with a French connection, with questions that come from you, the author's fans and followers. Then, the authors treat us to a reading from their books. Listen now to Storytime in Paris on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with City of Muses after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio.
It was later, so this is the big jump, I guess, that one Christmas, and I don't think I had asked for this, but so these were all Christmas presents, I guess. Poetry came to me at Christmas time. They knew that I liked Jewel Kilcher, Jewel, from the 1990s, early 2000s, and Jewel put out a poetry collection, and she was dreamy to me. She was this she had left everything. She was wild. She lived in a car. Her songs, I haven't listened to her in a while, and she got, ever more precious and kind of, produced in a certain way. But, Pieces of You and all of that, that stuff was pretty powerful for me. And I remember reading that. And, there were lines about looking at I don't remember what magazine it is, but in the collection, she talks about, kind of comparing body image while looking at insert, I don't know, beauty magazine from the United States. I don't remember if it was Teen Vogue or what, but that was a time where I guess poetry just felt like a little tiny bit closer to me. And I thought, later I told somebody this at an English conference when I was an undergrad. An older man asked me after I had read my own poetry, "What do you read?" And I said, my friends and Jewel, and he lost it on me. And just I don't even know the package of language he gave me, but it was derisive. It was not flattering. He did not understand why anybody at a conference would be talking about the poetry of Jewel, or even it felt like he was saying your peers are not also influence, that I should be able to cite much more recognizable things, whether it be, I don't know, Frank O'Hara or Louise Gluck or Glick, or I don't know, other names that felt like power names to mention in a poetry conference or an English conference. So it was a little bit shaming for me to have received that and thought I was just trying to be sincere and genuine. And,
yeah, that's awful.
Jewel is not maybe the best poet, but she was somebody that still wrote poetry. She wrote her own lyrics. She wrote her own music. I feel like people forget that even though she's a kind of passé thing of the 90s, she was almost auto-producing at the earliest part of her career too. I don't think she doesn't get the badass reputation like Cobain or somebody, but
But how awful would the world be if we all drew inspiration from the exact same place? We'd all be producing the exact same thing.
Agreed. Well, and I think sometimes when it's a question of influence, it's not always the most reputable writer that makes you walk onto your own page. It's somebody that just feels relatable. And I mean, Jewel felt very relatable to me. I wanted to disappear from the South. I had a used car that my parents had helped me get, a little Saturn SL1 that was, just not the prettiest thing on the street, but I was ready to take that thing somewhere, and with, at least 5 CDs or something. And it was the influence question, I guess, and what you're saying, I don't know if we would have heard from a lot of people if there hadn't been an expansion around who could be called influence. And it's not even about calling, I think one of my greatest influences is my friend Perry Guevara, but he is not actively writing poetry right now, but he was there at the moment where I was trying to do something really different with saying out loud, I write poetry. And he was there at a formative time, and he was writing alongside me. And though he's gone into maybe more of an academic route with his writing, I don't think I ever think of poetry without him somewhere in the background. And nobody in poetry is going to be oh, the latest from Perry Guevara, even though he's published and doing amazing critical work, and could write poetry tomorrow if he wanted to. But yeah.
I think that's really important. I think that our influences should come from wherever they come from. And, oftentimes as a creative, you're responding to something. So even if it's something that's lowbrow or, pop culture gets a bad rap.
Yeah.
But even when you're responding to these sorts of things, that's still legitimate. You're still creating art from wherever it's coming from.
Yeah.
I don't understand these sorts of judgments. That's what holds us back. You have that person's voice in the back of your head, and that sets you back however many steps in your creative process, because you're trying to deal with your sense of yourself and imposter syndrome and this other random person's judgment of you.
It's true. And it's, I guess, the only thing that I can maybe say, I mean, because I think I see sometimes online, there are lots of things happening around Taylor Swift. And she's being compared to literary giants. When we think of a Whitman or something like this, I think there are probably American studies classes on her right now in the universities of the United States, which is only possible because people expanded the idea of what could be called kind of cultural studies of a country. They wouldn't have allowed that 50 years ago. And the only thing that seems problematic to me is if a young poet at a conference today cited Taylor Swift before we ever heard a word of hers, that new poet, that name might be so big as to not valorize the voice of the new person. And I think that's kind of difficult. But I think that's already what we're doing when that man, he wasn't young actually, he was senior. When that man was asking me about influence, I almost think I do believe that he sort of congratulated me on the reading, which could have just meant like, you did it. Not like, I like your work. But I do think if I had answered with something that validated his worldview of poetry, the conversation would have gone very differently. And he wanted my response. If he liked my work, he wanted me to also like enter his registers of what a reality that's literary for him looks like. And I refused it, but not because I was trying to antagonize. That was before I became more antagonistic.
Now it would be done on purpose.
Yeah. Now I'm going to talk about Jewel on podcast in 2023 and say that I was really righteous there.
Well, so let's talk about another person who seems to have influenced your work.
Okay.
Tallulah Bankhead?
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell us about this project?
Absolutely. Well, it's a project that has, I guess, a longish story to it as far as how much that woman kind of stayed in my consciousness and the different moments where I gave her more or less attention. The book that I've now released with Paris Heretics is Loving Tallulah Bankhead, which actually the first poem of that book, which is the titular poem, it's also called Loving Tallulah Bankhead, started out entitled Not Loving Tallulah. I think I wasn't calling her Bankhead yet in that first poem, but just Not Loving Tallulah. And it was I guess at that moment, and what is still a kind of research back into what senses of self and womanhood and self-presentation I received growing up in U.S. Southeastern region. And Tallulah was somebody that was very known and celebrated because Alabama is her home state and is mine as well. But she was a caricature of a person. She was very one-dimensional, I think, from the very first time I met her. And I don't know if that was always just the South. I think even Tallulah might have had a bit of a hand in a reduction of all of the dimensions of her. But because of the dimension that I think was saved in cultural memory the most, both for the South and maybe for a larger U.S. culture, she was kind of a joke in a way, like a good joke, very like rich, funny, sassy kind of joke, but not seen as progressive, not seen as, I would say, certainly in my home culture in the Southeast, as feminine. Like her femininity was very questioned. People seemed to, by invoking her deeper voice, kind of say this woman was, like 2 degrees away from being not a woman, which, that's a whole other conversation about where we're trying to assign or how much a person wants to perform the gender that they identify as their own, or how much of any little nuance of that they want to wear on their body or in their persona. But yes, so I heard of her name and I loved her name, and I heard of her kind of famous gesture with a cigarette, and she has a kind of catchphrase that's not just darling everywhere, and this almost like as if everything about her personality was like a martini glass running over, like just things flooded out, just an exuberance and I don't know. I was attracted to it. The attraction, I think, could be read in a lot of ways. I've thought about it myself. I think in the poems, there's a lot of exploration of it. But what it meant and what it means to be drawn to a person who is at once being reduced by a culture at the same time that she's being lifted up. And also, I guess simultaneously being forgotten, because caricatures only last so long, I think. They don't have the staying power, but I think that there is a lot to Tallulah to remember that wasn't just her party face, though the party face is also very important.
Really interesting. And your collection, this book has poems and plays and all sorts of different writing in it. How did that all come to be?
It's mostly poetry. It also features drawings, illustrations by Lauren Patterson, who's my cousin, but also an Alabama native. And it was important for me that a lot of the people that might be a part of the project, and even some people that wrote blurbs for the book as it was coming out, were all people with strong connections to the state. So I wanted it to have Southern womanhood and all of its variation kind of present, and also for women artists, because Tallulah is an artist. And I think people forget that she was searching her whole life to be an artist, not a coke addict, or something. I mean, that troubled her and maybe even made her say and be in certain context. Like maybe that's why she said certain things. I don't know. But that her substance use, I think, is an interesting element of her, and I would never leave it out. But I think that there's a lot about her artistry that people haven't really given light to. But yes, in the collection, there are poems, and at the very end of the collection, I call it a poem play, which I think there are some that exist, but it was a really new way for me to write. But because Tallulah began in theater and loved, I think, the stage the most, more so than the camera, even though she was in film, it felt like a cool place to go with it.
Amazing. Do you think we could hear a little bit, maybe one of your poems?
Sure. I'll read one that I wrote a draft of while I was living in New Orleans, which was, I left that city in 2014. So this one is actually ancient. This one's called Tallulah Wraps Her Fingers Around My Drink. And I wrap mine around hers, quietly, as we wait for spirituality's spoon to deliver us to candlelight, and jealousy to cork doldrum right in the sipper. Our silhouettes are like two women fighting the same body, or maybe like one body fighting two terribly angular faces. Our legs swish under the table, and I feel like saying, taffeta. It's then we separate, contemplate just how self-centered we can get, what with good grammar and a liberal education. All this at sundown, of course, in the shallows of the yellow kitchen, where my roux cackles louder than she can, and the burning butter is the smell of her hair. So we spray the air with our questions, walk the dim hall to go out to mock the moon. All we feel in us is the night, as in all we feel in us is a sea of terrible euphemism, as in the water is smaller and kept, as in they built moats around us. We sit there, mope, in our whiskey-crisping critiques, and wait for the men to turn to brooms, the women to swoon and whisper, and for our words to sink in with the sureness of how we fought for them. Our plots twist up our legs like Jasmine, and her fingers wrap around my drink, and mine around hers, so that we are woven, accomplice, outspoken in our silence. Two women, two terribly angular faces.
Beautiful. I love your voice, literally and metaphorically. I really love the way that you write.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That's very kind to hear.
Is Paris the most romantic city in the world? Host Lily Heisey answers this very question in her podcast, Romancing in Paris, which takes you through the city, arrondissement by arrondissement, by exploring the most romantic and hidden spots Paris has to offer. Listen now to Romancing in Paris on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with City of Muses after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. What are you working on at the moment?
I am working on the rest of my life. I'm working on finalizing the co-translation with Amanda Murphy. I am also looking at a few projects that will probably center around a French writer that I really love, a woman named Hélène Bessette, and she wrote novels in verse. So the French, and I think she herself called herself a novelist, but I have a hard time resisting also calling her a little bit to a poet. And then I also have started a new kind of experiment for me, because it's not really how I have written in the past, but I'm working on a Substack that's called Spiritual Material, Musings from My Secondhand Parisian Wardrobe. So it's really an exploration of maybe something I alluded to earlier, but a kind of wonderment about what we're doing in our most superficial presentations of self, and also what we put on us and how we go outside, what is kind of going back to a soul element, a spiritual element of self. So that's where I'm writing currently, but Substack is supposed to be this live audience piece, and I'm not. I mean, I have to just say I'm uncomfortable, but it felt like an interesting challenge for myself in my writing as I move forward in what might be the next set of poems. And it's not poetry, so.
Fabulous. So where can people find you and your Substack and all of that if they want to keep up to date with what you're doing?
I do try to regroup everything on my website. So that's just my name, carriechappell.com. And it's double, lots of letters, double R, double P, double L. Yeah. And I have, you might have to click around a bit. I don't have a link tree or anything, but that's where I try to keep it up to date, except with sometimes little links need replacing or updating.
Perfect. Okay, so I will include that in our show notes so people can find you really easily.
Oh, great.
And thank you so much. This was a lovely conversation. I really feel like I could just keep talking to you forever.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, yes, it's been lovely for me to hear from you too. And I know you hear about creative worlds from all kinds of artists. So it's been nice to hear you kind of coming with your questions that have the nuance of understanding where each person's artistic universe might lie.
Oh, thank you. That's a very nice thing to say. Thank you for listening to City of Muses. If you like what you've heard, please take a moment to rate and review it. This is the fastest and easiest way to help support the podcast. Tell a friend who could use a little inspiration. You can also subscribe to the Paris Underground Radio newsletter over on our website, which comes out every Sunday and gives a little peek into what's on the network for the week ahead. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. Thank you for listening, and may you find inspiration wherever you go. City of Muses was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio.